Get ready for a fantastic conversation with Dorie Clark on all things speaking, including what to charge, TEDx Talks, and more on this episode of the Speaking Your Brand podcast. More and more women are making an impact by starting businesses, running for office, and speaking up for what matters. With my background as a TV political analyst, entrepreneur, and speaker, I interview and coach purpose-driven women to shape their brands, grow their companies, and become recognized as influencers in their field. This is Speaking Your Brand, your place to learn how to persuasively communicate your message to your audience. Hi there, and welcome to the Speaking Your Brand podcast. I'm your host, Carol Cox. How are you doing as we get towards the end of the year? Just like 2021, I feel like 2022 has just flown by, especially compared to how slow 2020 was. I've had a lot going on in the past few months, lots of virtual presentations, 2 in-person speaking engagements, 1 in Washington State, 1 in Miami, Florida. I also was on the news on election night for the midterms. And then we had a hurricane come through here in Orlando, Florida at the end of September. Then we had another kind of a hurricane tropical storm the week of the midterm election. So it's been quite a whirlwind, as you can say. But I'm excited today for you to hear the conversation that I have with Dorie Clark, who is a top business thinker, a best-selling author, and a keynote speaker. She also has given 4 TEDx Talks since 2015. Her most recent one from earlier this year currently has over 1.7 million views. That is unbelievable. I've been a fan of Dorie since reading her books years ago, including her most recent book called The Long Game. She also has Entrepreneurial You, Reinventing You, and Stand Out. All these are excellent books, and I recommend all of them. Dorie and I talk about her goal of writing a musical that appears on Broadway. And with my love of Hamilton, which if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you know how obsessed I am with that musical. And I really want to create like a women-centric version of Hamilton. So I had to start there with Dorie in our conversation. And then we dive into what it means to think and set long-term goals in a short-term world. And this comes from her book, The Long Game. We also then talk about what makes a great TEDx talk, and she's delivered 4 of them, so she knows. And here's a hint, it's the opposite of what we do in our businesses. Dorie shares her experience and what to charge for speaking engagements, whether you're just starting out or you're more established as a speaker, and much more. I know you're really going to enjoy this very fun and lively conversation about all things speaking. If you haven't yet taken our speaker archetype quiz, you're invited to do so. It's completely free. It's fun. It's 10 multiple choice questions. It only takes a few minutes to answer them and get your results. And then once you get your results, you're going to know which of the 4 speaker archetypes I've identified you are. You'll get our recommendations on how to leverage your natural strengths with your speaker archetype and what to add to them to make you an even more multi-dimensional speaker. You can take our free quiz by going to speakingyourbrand.com/quiz. Again, that's speakingyourbrand.com/quiz. Now, let's get on with the show. Welcome to the podcast, Dorie.
Well, hello, Carol. I'm so glad to be here.
I am too. We have so many things to talk about today that I know our listeners are going to get so much value out of. The very first thing that I have to ask you about after reading your book, The Long Game, is about writing a musical. Listeners of this podcast know that I'm obsessed with Hamilton, the musical. I've seen it at least 6 times on Disney Plus. I've listened to the soundtrack at least 100 times. I know every single word, and I have no musical ability. I am tone deaf. I cannot sing, and I don't play any instruments. I did take piano for 3 years when I was in middle school, and I think my parents quickly decided that was not a good hobby for me when I would practice at home. So Dorie, what got you interested in wanting to write a musical, and can you tell us a little bit about what that process was like?
Absolutely. And I feel like Hamilton is a good pick for your talents, Carol, because you can kind of rap, you don't really have to sing. So you can just like really lean in on that. It had never occurred to me to write a musical. This was not a long-standing goal. It's not like I grew up loving musicals or anything. My family absolutely did not play, music from musicals or anything like that. But as it happened, I actually, and I talk about this in my book, The Long Game, I decided in 2015, I had been on the road so much, speaking a ton, which we'll definitely talk about. I gave 74 talks that year, and it was so preposterous and ridiculous. I was on the road so much, and I was living in New York at the time. And I was sort of saying to myself, why am I living in the most expensive city in the world if I'm not there? Like this expensive apartment kind of lying fallow. And so I decided I would do something about it. So I created a New Year's resolution for myself in 2016, which I called the one uniquely New York activity per week. And so one of the first ones that I did, as you might imagine, was I went to a Broadway show. And it was the show Fun Home, which ended up winning the Tony. And it just hit me. It just hit me right that, I'd gone to shows before, but this was one that really I connected with. And I woke up the next morning, I'm like, I need to write a musical. I just had this like absolute sense of conviction about it. And so I decided to start learning about it and learning about how to do it. And so 6 years later, I am still working on this. I created a 10-year plan for myself that year in 2016 that I would write a show that made it to Broadway. So I am assiduously working toward my 2026 goal of having a Broadway show.
Well, I will definitely be a ticket buyer and I will fly to New York to see it when it's there.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
And I know you describe in the book that there's actually a program that you can enroll in that will help you to write a musical, and that you don't have to be able to write the actual musical parts. You can partner with someone to do the music, and then you can do the lyrics.
That is correct. And to be clear, this is not some lame shortcut. This is actually how musicals are typically done. That, when we think about famous musical combinations, you think about, like Rodgers and Hammerstein, or you think about, Lerner and Lowe, or, things like that. There's a reason, which is that it is most standard for there to be a composer and a lyricist, and then they work together, each person sort of leveraging their highest skills. Now, some people are like the triple threats. They can do everything, like your pal Lin-Manuel wrote the music and the lyrics and the so-called book, the script for Hamilton. But, most people don't do that. So if you are not the best musician, but you are interested in musicals, you could be a lyricist or a librettist, which is what I did.
All right. So my goal has not been deterred despite my musical ability. So I'm excited. Okay. So the reason that I know you wrote about this in your book, Dorie, called The Long Game, and the reason that I'm bringing this up here in this conversation is because setting a 10-year plan, I know businesses used to do this all the time. They would set 5-year, 10-year, 20-year plans. And I feel like in the past 10 years, probably since the economic recession, that it's so many of us, whether it's in our careers or businesses, feels like it's almost foolhardy to set plans for so long because things seem so uncertain and unstable. Yet, to your point, you wouldn't be as far as you are now into, say, this 10-year desire to have a musical on Broadway if you didn't set that intention and that goal and take the steps to make it happen. So let me ask you this first. Why? Okay, maybe I'll ask this for myself. Why is it hard for me to set long-term plans and goals?
Well, I think there's a few things that are going on for most people. We can drill down and diagnose you specifically, Carol. But I would say in general, for a lot of people, one element which you've pointed to is some people say, well, sort of, why should I bother? Because things are moving so fast on the ground. Wouldn't it be irrelevant? My answer to that is, kind of, so what? Like the whole point is, it's not like you're opening your veins and signing in blood. You have an intention. If something better comes along, God, take it, like that's okay. You can change. But having a provisional 10-year goal is a really good thing because, to your point, it gives you something to work toward. If it turns out that circumstances change, there's something crazy, there's something you can't predict, maybe you decide, I don't really want that goal anymore. It's fine. You can change, but the act of having worked toward it inherently gives you more opportunities because you are further along on the path and you probably have new skills or new connections or new knowledge that you wouldn't have if you hadn't pursued it. The second reason why a lot of people eschew long-term plans, and, for the sake of argument, let's call it a 10-year plan. It could be 5, it could be 20, whatever we're thinking. But generally, sometimes people say, well, I wouldn't know how to accomplish it. And I actually think that's fine too. It is almost hubristic to imagine that we currently possess the knowledge to figure out how not just your desires and skills and preferences will play out over 10 years, but how literally everything else in the world will play out. Like, no, nobody's going to do that. You could have a massive, complicated goal. You don't have to know how to accomplish it now. All you need to know is literally what is your next step It's like driving in the fog. You can get there 3 feet at a time. You just need to keep moving forward. And you don't have to know the outcome.
And Dorie, I really appreciate what you write about in your book. And I took a bunch of notes and highlights. And here are the 3 things that stuck out to me the most that I want to share with the listeners, and then also have you tell us a little bit more about it. So here are the 3 bullet points. This is from your book. Number 1, everything takes longer than we want it to. And then you said everything. And number 2 is the challenge for all of us is an inner one to keep going when it seems like no one is paying attention or cares, and to believe that eventually the world will catch up. And then number 3, the trade-off that most of us, or you said most companies, I would say us in general, refuse to make was accepting that in order to be great at something, you had to be willing to be bad at something else. So tell us more. How did these fit in to not only what you wanted to write about in the book, but to what you were seeing was going on for yourself?
Well, everything takes longer than we might imagine. I mean, I feel like in some ways it's self-evident, right? I mean, I had a handyman here today. This is his 3rd time here because he installed a new faucet, and it's like, oh, good, that's done. No, the faucet keeps leaking. It's like, it's not done. This is the 3rd visit. And we understand, I think, sometimes that with home maintenance, that's the case. But what is true for home maintenance is also true for our businesses. You want it to be, oh, here's the plan, I'm going to do it, blah, blah, blah. But, there's just like you're driving and like, oh, there's a traffic jam. There's metaphorical traffic jams in almost all elements of our business. Occasionally, we might luck out and something is easier than we thought it is. But the vast majority of time, we're optimists by nature. So we tend to systematically underestimate how long things take. And, it's not the end of the world. But the problem comes when we start to get depressed or we start to draw conclusions from it. Oh, it's so hard. It's just not working for me. I guess I don't have what it takes. Oh, I guess it wasn't meant to be. That's my favorite line. It wasn't meant to be. It's like, come on. It's so self-defeatist, and it's so easy to ascribe some logic to the powers of the universe when actually the answer is you just need to work harder. You need to work longer. You need to be willing to understand that, okay, it probably is going to take, 10 rejections or whatever it is. A lot of people are willing to try it once or twice, but, where the rubber meets the road is when you're willing to do it, 10 or 20 times. But that's actually where a lot of the success comes through.
And it reminds me that I have this little slideshow that I share in one of our program calls around the business of speaking. And I have this example of, I spoke at this event in 2010. So it was kind of like coming into the speaking circuit here in Orlando in the job that I had at the time. And from that one speaking engagement, I got a bunch of other speaking invitations, because we know that best way to get speaking invitations is to go out there and speak, because then event organizers see you. And I have this progression where from that small conference into a big stage took 2 years. And I see that time and again, if I look back at all these different things in my career, other people I know, whether it's starting a business and getting traction or starting speaking and getting traction, it seems to be, it's like that. You have to just keep at it for those 2 years.
Yeah, I think that's right on, Carol. And in fact, one of the things that I talk about in the long game is people sometimes ask, and of course, this is the unanswerable question, but I really do try to put a number on it, because that's the thing that people are really desperate for. People want to know, how long does it take to become successful? How long does it take to become a recognized expert in your field, which is something that I write about and talk about a lot. And what I've discovered, and I now have this course and community based around this. So I have about 700 people who have gone through the program. So I've actually gotten to have a pretty good, a pretty broad base and a pretty good longitudinal base, because it's been operating now for 6 years. So from what I have seen, not just in my own experience, but also from a wide variety of other people, is that typically it takes about 2 or 3 years, to your point, of very consistent effort to start to see results. And I want to emphasize, to start to see results. This doesn't mean you're going to be Brene Brown 2 years into it. It means that people are going to start to say, oh, I've heard of her. Or, oh, yeah, we could have you speak, but we don't have any money, or, something like that, right? You're starting to see some traction. And then it's at about year 5, typically, where you start to actually see some really meaningful traction, some meaningful results. But there's a lot of people who are not willing to go through that period of like between month 1 and month 24, basically, where there's not a lot of progress and they're like, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? And so they drop off. I mean, the advantage for you is if you're willing to do it, you start to see results because the competition is thinned. But a lot of people are not willing to push through that period.
Well, we think about isn't podcasting. So this podcasting has been airing weekly for almost 6 years, through over 300 episodes. And there are so many people who start podcasting and decide it's not for them. It isn't for everyone, for sure. Like it takes a lot of dedication, but that's why if you do stick to it, you will definitely see the results of that consistency. And that goes to the second bullet point I shared, which is about continuing to keep going even when you think no one is paying attention or no one cares. And I remember the first 9 months or 12 months of this podcast, a little bit of downloads, a little bit of downloads, a little bit of downloads. And I told myself I would do it for at least a year, would not even look at the download numbers because that didn't matter. I had to just focus on the consistency.
Yeah, it's so right. A few years ago, I wrote a book called Entrepreneurial You. And in Entrepreneurial You, I write about a guy named Jordan Harbinger, who's now a fairly well-known podcaster. But one sort of fun fact, he's been podcasting since something like 2007. I mean, like literally like the earliest days. He's now been doing it like 15 years, which is part of why he is a successful podcaster. But he said that he went in once early on when he heard that you could get statistics. He went in once to look at it. He found it depressing. And then he didn't look at it for like another, I think it was 3 or 4 years.
Yes.
And sometimes you just need to shield yourself from reality.
Yes. Just either assume no one's listening. So that way you can just talk about whatever you want and you won't censor yourself, or just assume lots and lots of people are listening and paying attention. All right, let's go to the third bullet point, which is about accepting that in order to be great at something, you had to be willing to be bad at something else. So Dorie, what was that for you?
Yeah. So where this comes from, a while back, I read a great book by Frances Fry, who's a Harvard Business School professor, and her partner, Ann Morris. And it was called Uncommon Service. And they were talking about service industry businesses. And they had this, sort of key point that in order for a company, for, like a bank or an airline or something to be excellent, to be great at something, they, because obviously, if you think about it, time, energy, money, these are not unlimited resources. You have to make trade-offs. And so the reason that so many things are average is that these banks, these companies, whatever, were not willing to make trade-offs. So they ended up average at everything. But what they said, which I think makes a lot of sense, is if you want to be great at something, well, where's that money going to come from? Where's that energy going to come from? It needs to come from somewhere. So you've got to choose commensurately something else to be bad at and make a strategic choice about it. And I thought about it and I was like, wow, that is true for people as well. We have to do this. And, it's hard. Not everybody wants to do that or is willing to do that, but you got to buckle down. So I would say in my own personal life, I mean, there's sort of prosaic examples. Like, I have decided to be like a bad at domesticity. And so I pay people to do kind of all the things for me because it's just not a strong suit, let's say. But also in business, I mean, the truth is I am constantly underwater with my email. I hate it. I don't like being that way, but you have to make choices and make space to do important work. If you have like a 6-figure contract, you can't be mucking around answering your emails. You need to focus on, okay, I really need to work on this proposal because this could really move my business forward. And you don't want to get distracted by somebody asking you for a fairly inconsequential thing. So I will keep people waiting sometimes. And again, I don't love this. I do feel bad about it, but I have to move past it. I'm like, if somebody's like, hey, will you tweet about my blah, blah, blah? like, yes, I'd like to help you, and I'm glad to help you at some point, but it's probably not going to be tomorrow because I have a thing that really needs to happen.
Yeah, I totally hear you on that, Dorie. It reminds me that when I'm preparing, say, for a new talk or I'm working on a creative project, I literally have to clear my calendar of Zoom calls, appointments. And so I generally find like a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday is the best stretch of time for me to work because no one's asking of anything of me because they don't really expect a response from me until even late on Monday. So I had all that clear space to work.
Yes. So good. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So you mentioned your book, Entrepreneurial You, and I know that you have a section on there on speaking, which is another fantastic book. And I'll make sure to include links in the show notes to these books as well. So let's chat about your speaking career. Like you've mentioned, you have done a lot of speaking over the years. What are your favorite types of speaking engagements, formats, venues, audiences, topics? If you could wave a magic wand and like just do those, what would they be?
I'm fairly agnostic about it, actually. I mean, I would say one that I look back on really fondly was there was this resort in Arizona and they gave people s'mores. That was definitely, I mean, it's, not directly related to the speaking element, but it was a very good side benefit. But you
can put that in your speaking contract. Like removing the green M&Ms. You can say there must be s'mores.
Yeah,
for me.
Yeah, that was really good. But I think that for me, what's really fun is just seeing an audience connect with it. And so that's not necessarily dependent on the size or the venue or the audience per se. I am happy to speak to all kinds of different audiences. I mean, the key thing, not to be too mercenary, but after COVID, like a lot of people, I really was sort of evaluating how I wanted to structure things moving forward, and I realized I had been a little too profligate with my travel pre-COVID. I mean, I was, as I talk about in the long game, I sort of start out with me having this like hellacious day on the road, like flying to one city and then like starting work and working a full day in a different time zone and then working the next day and then flying to a different city. And it was just crazy. And I realized I don't want it to be quite that bad. So I raised my speaking fees and I got very, very, judicious about, things that I might have kind of bent on about, it's a favor for a friend or, it's a really good audience, and being willing to accept a lower fee. I'm just like, no, that's just really not necessary anymore.
Yeah. And I feel like, Dorie, I hear this from my other speaker friends as well, that most of us are in that same boat. And I think the pandemic, number one, just kind of got us out of the travel habit. And so now if we are going to get on an airplane and navigate the airports, it better be for something that we're really excited about and that compensates appropriately for it. All right. So then let's talk about your TEDx Talks. You have done 4 of them. So 4 since 2015. Your most recent one was this year in 2022. And obviously you do a great job at your TEDx Talks. I think your most recent one has almost over 1 million views already on that one.
It's at about 1.7 right now.
1.7 million, yeah, which is great since it just came out this year. And that's called The Real Reason You Feel So Busy and What to Do About It. What is it that you like about the TEDx Talk format? And how do you go about deciding what you want to talk about and then preparing the actual talk?
So the biggest thing that I really like about the TEDx format, I've, as evinced by the fact that I've done 4 of them, you can tell I'm a believer in it. A lot of speakers stress out about their reel and having to have their speaker video. It's great if you have a nice speaker video for sure, but a lot of people don't have one. They don't have enough footage for it, or especially during COVID, like, you're going to have a bunch of pictures of you doing Zooms. Right. I mean, okay. But it's not quite the same. So in lieu of a speaker video, what's really great about a TEDx Talk is that it's a very short, pithy example of you speaking. Oftentimes, if you're speaking at a conference, you're going to have a committee of people evaluating you. So, often it's not just one person. So they have some kind of an asset that they want to send around. And you might have one booster like, oh yeah, this person, she's great. You got to hire her. But they need to convince other people. So they need a tool to be able to do it. And yes, a speaker reel could be one of those tools. But if you don't have one, having a really tight video, by which I mean 6 minutes is great, maybe 9, maybe 12, not more than that, just something that somebody could watch, is really helpful. And TEDx is again, not all of them actually do this, but in theory, they're supposed to have high quality cameras. They sign a contract where they're supposed to have a 3-camera shoot. And so if you at least evaluate carefully, what the person has done before, assuming it's an organizer who's done it before, then you can actually be somewhat guaranteed, at the end of this, I'm going to have a very nice asset I can show people, which is quite valuable. And so in my case, the things that I've done talks about have all been related to my books. Sometimes it's about the broad theme of the book. Sometimes it's about a facet of the book that I've drawn out, but it's intended as a way of getting the ideas behind the book in greater circulation.
Okay. And then how do you go about actually, obviously, especially since so many of your talks come from your books, which are 250 pages, how do you just decide how to distill that into an 8 or 10 minute talk?
Yeah. For the most recent book, The Long Game, I turned that into an 8-minute talk. It was called the Real Reason Why You're So Busy and What to Do About It. And that was basically a few sections, not even really a chapter of my book, but it was a few sections of it. So I think that we often want to give a talk and give like the whole concept, like this is the totality of my book, in 12 minutes or whatever. And that's hard to do. And I tried to do it in the past too. But what I think is better almost always is narrow casting. And I've kind of learned that lesson, which is why I think the current talk is exponentially more successful than the previous talks that I did.
So the more narrow, the better.
Yeah. I mean, narrow in terms of what you're trying to talk about and accomplish, but hopefully broadly of interest to people in general. Something that, you don't want to give a talk that's only appealing to if you're a left-handed gardening dentist or something, you want to talk that just about everybody can relate to in some way. And it's not inherently ruling people out because they're like, well, I'm not an X or a Y.
Yes, it's almost the opposite of what we're supposed to be doing marketing wise in our business, which is very much focusing on a very specific customer segment and niche, but really in keynotes and in TEDx Talks is thinking more of the general audience, the layperson audience.
Yeah, exactly. I often have, clients or colleagues that, come to me and they're sort of hopped up about, I have this idea and it's about, how leaders can manage performance reviews better. I'm like, that's a great business talk, but if you're giving a TEDx, there's grannies in the audience, there's high school students in the audience. They are not going to give a crap about that. That's the wrong way to do a TEDx talk. You have to understand what the medium is about. So find the grain in there that is relevant to anybody. I mean, my good friend and client, Liz Kislick, has a talk that I think has been seen more than over 300 now. I believe it's over 400,000 times. And it was a talk about navigating conflict. And that's something that just about anybody can, certainly has corporate ramifications, but just about anybody can appreciate it or relate to it in their own lives.
That's a great example. Yeah, thanks, Dorie. And I appreciate that kind of that distinction between what we do in our business versus what we can do in these broader speaking engagements. So you mentioned before about making sure that now when you do speaking, that obviously you're getting compensated appropriately with your speaking fees because of everything that goes into it. Obviously, you have a very, very successful track record with all of your experience and expertise, as you should be well compensated for it. So for those of the podcast listeners who maybe are a little bit earlier in their speaking career, I know this is a question I get asked all the time. And, when I share this with our clients, but what would you say as far as when they say, what should I charge for my speaking?
Yeah, that's an important question. And to be clear, I started my business in 2006 and I did not get paid for speaking engagement until 2013. So for 7 years, I was speaking, regularly as I could for $0. So I put in a lot of time doing that before I actually started getting paid money to speak. If people are thinking about what to charge, sometimes honestly, the answer is $0 because, maybe you're new at it. Maybe you're, sort of getting comfortable and practicing. Maybe it is an organization you just really want to get in front of because it could look good in your bio, or you could get a testimonial quote that would be valuable, or it's a room full of really super hot prospects. Those are places where it's perfectly appropriate to be like, all right, sure, I'll do it. But if you are at a place where you either don't want to do it for free because you're like, you know what? I mean, it's not super necessary for my business. I can, give it or take it. Well, in that case, it's a great opportunity to ask for money because if they say no, who cares, right? So you can afford to be bold. But I actually I wrote an article for Harvard Business Review, which is about how to know what to charge for your speech. So people can Google it. You can probably put a link perhaps in the show notes to it. And I hope it might be helpful. In fact, I actually made a new friend because there's a guy named Wally Green who is, of all things, he's like a ping pong champion. And he's the co-founder of something called Spin, which is a ping pong chain in New York and a number of other cities. And he'd started to get a number of speaking engagements because the New York Times did a story about him and people were reaching out and he didn't know what to charge. So he Googled my article and he found it and he's like, oh, this is really helpful. And so he was nice enough to message me afterwards and tell me like, oh, your article was so helpful. So then, we met up, we had dinner. So that's been very nice to be able to be useful in that way. But, broadly speaking, for a new speaker, if you're going to be charging something, I mean, depending how new you are, I would say, $1,500, $2,500 is kind of a good entry level. 5,000 is kind of a good like starting point for someone who's like starting to get a little traction. Like maybe you got a book, maybe you got, some kind of social proof and you kind of, go up from there. I mean, kind of a rule of thumb. I mean, are there rules of thumb? I don't know. I'm claiming it is. But I would say you can probably increase like by maybe $5,000 for every feather in your cap, let's call it. Like it could be like, oh, I wrote a new book. Let's add 5K. Or, oh, I got recognized with this like really good profile in this high profile publication. Oh, I'll add 5K. And so you sort of ratchet up from there. But, for somebody who's like really pretty new, assuming you're not going to do it for free, I would say ask $1,500, $2,500, and then, 5K once you start to really get your sea legs. I don't know. Do you agree with that? What do you think, Carol?
Yes, I see the same thing for people starting out, the 1,500 to 2,500. And the reason is doing that will show you that there are places that will pay. So I think for so many of us, we assume that these groups don't have budgets, they're not going to pay me that much. So just asking, you will be surprised that oftentimes you will get that, what you want, or even asking them what their budget is. And you will find that sometimes it's even higher. And what I also find with so many of the women that we work with is that they dramatically undercharge, especially say for workshops and trainings for companies, that they will go in really low because they think of themselves as the buyer, as the solopreneur, but you're not the buyer. The company is the buyer. They have bigger budgets. So make sure not to undercharge for what you're providing to them.
Yeah, it's so important. I'll just briefly share a story in case it might be helpful to your listeners. This is something I actually talk about in my book, Entrepreneurial You. The very first paid speaking engagement I ever got, it was almost an accident that it was a paid speaking engagement because I had my first book, Reinventing You, was coming out. And I got, I had been working hard, to sort of lay the groundwork for it. So I'd been like writing for different publications and things like that. So it was very exciting. I got an email that came in and it was from a conference and it was going to be a bit, kind of a big conference. It sounded like, and they wanted to know, would I speak at the conference? And I was like, oh, that sounds very exciting. That's a cool opportunity. And it was going to be for like 5,000 people. It was like, whoa, it was like a very large conference. And the truth was, like, I wanted to do it because it seemed exciting. It seemed neat. But I was so busy. I mean, it was just before my book launch and I was racing around and, it was just very, very hard. And so I asked them, I'm like, so what's your budget? And they're like, well, we're a nonprofit, so we really don't have a budget for this. And so I was like, all right, I wished I could do it and I felt bad, but I wrote back and I'm like, gosh, I'm really sorry. It's right before my book launch and, it's disappointing for me, but I'm going to have to decline. If it's an unpaid thing, I just don't have the bandwidth for it at this point. And literally within 2 minutes, they wrote back and they said, well, could you do it for $5,000? And I was like, what? Like, I believed you when you said, yep, we're a nonprofit, we don't have any budget. Like, how did there get to be a delta from 0 to 5K? Okay, I can believe it. Like, oh, maybe we could scratch out $250, but are you freaking kidding me? 0 to 5K? That was such an enormous difference. And of course, rationally now I understand, like, this is a 5,000 person conference. I mean, if you think literally what they're spending on the Starbucks, on the napkins, that's more than $5,000. So, I mean, people will just lie to you. They'll just freaking lie to you. So, like, you really have to recognize, like, yes, they have budget.
Oh my God. Thank you so much for sharing that, Dorie. Literally in our Thought Leader Academy call today, I was talking about don't assume that nonprofits don't have budgets to pay you as a speaker or as a trainer, because nonprofits, even though they're not for-profit businesses, that doesn't mean that they don't have money. It's just that they choose to allocate their money differently than a for-profit business does.
Yeah, so, absolutely.
Yes.
I mean, the classic example, of course, is Harvard, which has the $50 billion endowment. I mean, there's small countries that would really like to be as nonprofit-y as Harvard is.
Oh my gosh. All right. So good. What is the self-assessment tool that you have to share with us?
Yes, absolutely. I've created all kinds of self-assessments, but actually I think something that would be especially relevant for your audience that's focused on speaking is the Entrepreneurial You self-assessment that I have. It is basically a self-assessment to help you think through in your business how to create multiple revenue streams, including potentially a revenue stream around speaking. But, as entrepreneurs, we know that the more legs you have on your table, the more secure the table is. So it really kind of helps you think through how to apply it in your own life. And folks can get it for free at dorieclark.com/entrepreneur.
Okay, fantastic. DorieClark.com/entrepreneur. We will make sure to include a link in the show notes for that, and also to your LinkedIn profile, so listeners can connect with you there. Dorie, thank you so much for being on the Speaking Your Brand podcast.
Thank you, Carol. It's great to talk to you.
Thanks again to Dorie for coming on the podcast. Remember, if you haven't yet taken our speaker archetype quiz, you can do so for free. It just takes a couple of minutes. Go to speakingyourbrand.com/quiz. Again, that's speakingyourbrand.com/quiz. Until next time, thanks for listening.